Welcome to a special bonus episode of the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this extra off-topic cast, I continue a conversation I had with Wisconsin author Mark O'Connell. I had to veer off topic in our interview to cover a notable subject on O'Connell's resume. He contributed to episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I couldn't get off the phone with him until I talked about that a little bit and a few other science fiction matters. In addition to writing the book The Close Encounters Man, O'Connell also teaches screenwriting at DePaul University in Chicago. Why do you feel like you personally have been drawn to this subject matter throughout the course of your life? I think I've read you say that you grew up watching Star Trek and that made a big dent on your life. And some of the science fiction work throughout, your early life kind of piqued your interest. But what has kind of kept it as something that you can't shake or that you want to continue to explore?
I really wish I knew. It's a very hard question to answer. I mean, I can tell you when my fascination began. I've told this story like 100 times in the last few months. When I was 3.5 years old, in 1963, a new TV show premiered called The Outer Limits, and it was all about aliens and monsters from space. And for some strange reason, that show was on when it premiered. That show was on our TV in our rec room. And when this glowing alien monster appeared, I was so terrified that I ran upstairs and hid behind the corner, and I wouldn't come out again until the monster went away. And that's literally my first conscious memory. So it goes all the way back to then. And for some reason, being terrified of this alien monster turned into a fascination with all things alien and UFO and related to space and space travel and astronomy. It's always been there. It always will be. I can't really explain it except to point to that one moment of seeing the monster on the Outer Limits.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always tell people I really like movies, but I don't like scary movies because they don't scare me. I'm just never afraid of them. I'm just whatever. But there's this one movie that I was terrified of as a child, and it was Fire in the Sky. Which is a case you detail in the book, the specifics, not the movie version of it necessarily, but and that movie has always kind of stood out to me and terrified me. But I'm just kind of curious if how you feel about the idea of extraterrestrial life. Are you afraid of it, or are you hopeful about it?
I think I lean more towards hopeful than terrified. I don't think you can completely divest yourself of some amount of terror at the unknown, because it's what we've been conditioned to expect from alien life, right? We've been conditioned to expect that it would be a glowing monster like the one in the Outer Limits, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So yeah, I lean more towards hopeful, but there's definitely like a residue of of fear and worry.
Right.
And then, of course, there's, I put in the quote from Stephen Hawking in the book about how, whether or not advanced aliens are friendly or malevolent, that's almost irrelevant, because anytime a superior culture comes in contact with an inferior culture, it doesn't go too well for the inferior culture. They essentially get wiped out. Even if there's no ill intent involved, they just get wiped out just because that's what happens.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about Star Trek, as a big Star Trek fan myself. That's a hopeful future, so maybe that's a good way to go. You contributed to an episode of The Next Generation and then a handful of episodes of Deep Space Nine. Was that kind of like a dream come true for you? Growing up watching some of this science fiction stuff on television as a child, and then as an adult, getting the opportunity to contribute to the Star Trek universe? Yeah,
it was an absolutely amazing experience, and I'm very proud of the work I've done. Even though it was just a handful of episodes, there were two episodes in particular where I was able to tell a story that kind of, I won't say broke the rules, but it was kind of like that. One of my episodes, For the Cause, I didn't write the script, but I wrote the story. I'm really proud of that one because it moved forward one of the major story arcs that the show was dealing with in that particular season. And it's very hard for an outside writer. I was always a freelancer, coming in from the outside. It's very hard for a freelance writer to pitch a story that actually deals directly with one of the major story arcs of the show. So the fact that I was able to get that, sort of sneak that in there with this show that sort of toyed with one of the major characters in the show, that was very fun, and I was very happy with that. And the episode ended up being written by Ronald Moore, who went on to do Battlestar Galactica. So it was a great episode. And my episode, Who Mourns for Morn, I'm very proud of that one also because it's more or less a comedy episode, and it's virtually impossible to pitch a comedy to Star Trek. Because basically what they did not in the original series with Kirk and Spock, but in the later series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, they would always have an ensemble cast of like 7 characters, and there was always one character who was the quote, funny, unquote, character.
Right, yeah.
And if there was any funny business going on in the script, it could only be done by or to that character, which I always found kind of stifling. So the fact that I pitched a comedy show that actually was produced as a comedy episode, I felt pretty happy about that. And that episode, Who Mourns for Morn, was listed recently by the website io9.com as the number 72 of the top 100 Star Trek episodes of all time. So I'm very proud of that.
The one that kind of stands out to me of your work, and I haven't rewatched the Deep Space Nine ones, all of them. I watched a couple of them in the last week or so, just because I've been doing a rewatch. But the episode that you kind of contributed to that I instantly kind of knew when I saw you wrote it was Timescape. Because I think just the visual of it, could you describe maybe the setup of that episode a little bit for people?
Sure. It was the story I pitched to the producers was that Captain Picard and some of his officers have been away on a mission, so they've been away from the Starship Enterprise, and they're journeying back home to rendezvous with the Enterprise, and they start encountering some temporal anomalies. It's one of my favorite technobabble terms from Star Trek. They start encountering temporal anomalies that are becoming more and more intense as they approach the last location of the Enterprise. And when they finally locate their ship, they find that it's actually frozen in time, in suspended animation, but it's also in the heat of battle with a Romulan spaceship, and time has frozen at the exact instant before the Romulans are about to deliver the death blow to the Enterprise. So our characters, our heroes, have to figure out a way to get time moving again, knowing that when they do, the Enterprise is going to be destroyed immediately. So that it just sort of became sort of a puzzle episode.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember who ended up writing this. I think it was Brannon Braga ended up writing the script. And they just turned it into this really fun sort of puzzle episode where nothing really was the way it appeared. Everything you thought you understood about what was going on in this suspended animation turned out to be absolutely, completely different once time started moving again. So the episode had a lot of really, really clever twists and surprises. And I was very pleased with the way it ended up.
Yeah, it's just one of those episodes that it's almost like a perfect setup for like an hour television show. It's just very almost like a perfect bit of writing to kind of like come up with that concept for.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, yeah. My compliment to you. Yeah. You mentioned some of the techno jargon that they had on the show. Did you have any other ones that you really enjoyed? And how do you like come like? I'm sure there's like a show Bible that you get, but like, what is?
Oh, yeah.
How do you like kind of digest some of those bits of language? And what were some of your favorites?
Well, they actually have people on staff, scientific consultants on staff, who are on call whenever a writer gets to a point in a script where they want to sort of describe some sort of scientific process or scientific instrument or phenomenon, but they don't really know how to describe it in a way that will make it sound real. Then you call up these astronomical advisors, and I worked with two of them, Andre Barmanis and oh gosh, now I'm blanking on the second guy's name. It'll come to me. But I love these guys. They were both so fun to work with because they would be like, okay, that's interesting, Mark. Well, here's how we can describe it. And they'll tell you basically how to describe it in the script. And it always comes out sounding, Naren Shankar, he was the other scientific advisor. And it always ends up sounding like believable. So one of my favorites, though, this was one that actually I can take credit for. In my first episode of Deep Space Nine, one of the guest characters is this a terraformer. He's a scientist who he sees himself as an artist. He reforms barren planets into planets that can support life, and he sees himself as a brilliant artist because every new planet he creates is a work of art. It's a painting to him. So he's a huge egomaniac, and he was played by the incredible character actor Richard Kiley. I love watching that episode just because Richard Kiley has so much fun chewing up the scenery. But when his character is introduced, I wanted to introduce him in a context that would show not only what an egomaniac he is, but also show how he was willing to basically flirt with danger to an extreme degree to create his artistic vision. So I have him introduced inside some sort of test chamber where he's testing out the process of giving life to his planets. And I think I called it the flux chamber. And I thought, well, that's a stupid name. They'll fix that in the rewrite, I'm sure, because it's absolutely meaningless. But then the final episode was produced and aired, and sure enough, they called it the flux chamber. And I thought, wow, I guess it must have sounded better than I thought it did, because they stuck with it.
Nice. Have you gotten to check out the new Star Trek Discovery at all?
Did watch the first episode because it didn't cost any money, and I haven't watched any of the others because they do cost money, right, frankly. Right. And I honestly, personally, when I first started hearing about the new show, I was very excited to hear that Michelle Yeoh was cast as the captain of the starship, because I thought, I will watch that show because I love that actress. I would watch anything she's in. And then the show premiered, and I found out, she's only in the first 2 episodes. And then, spoiler alert, she gets killed off. And I thought, well, she's not in the show. I'm not sure if I want to watch it anymore. So I actually have not watched any more. I'm sure I will at some point, but my interest level is not really, really high at this point.
What's kind of your opinion on just where the Star Trek universe, or where it's at right now in terms of the remakes of the original series, the original characters, and just kind of the fandom right now? Do you have any overall opinion of where we're at in Star Trek?
Oh wow, you're really going deep into this.
Well, because I have some people who have some very strong opinions about the new movie, so I just wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A lot of people do, and I do too. And I'll go on record as saying I'm not always a huge fan of J.J. Abrams' work, and I think that, and I'm not a huge fan of what he's done with his Star Trek movies. I will be totally honest about that. The whole alternative timeline thing. Sure, it's a clever way to be able to tinker with the original Star Trek formula. But in my opinion, if you're a real Star Trek fan, you don't need to do that. You need to actually put a little more thought into actually writing stories that fit the existing timeline and that are just as entertaining as satisfying. To me, it's kind of it's a little bit of a cop out to say, well, I'm gonna slightly adjust the timeline so that Spock can have feelings, Spock can be in love with someone. Kirk is this sort of bully boy with an anger management problem. It's like, no, I don't think so. I have a hard time with that.
So you teach some writing. I'm curious if you have any writing tips for people, or do you, when you approach writing, whether it is a script or in writing your recent book, do you kind of have like a philosophy of how you write?
Yeah, and actually, a lot of it comes from my experience working with Star Trek and just sort of learning their process of sort of deconstructing the story and then reconstructing it bit by bit in a way that will fit their production needs and their philosophy for the show. So it's a very meticulous. I take my students through a pretty meticulous process. It's not always fun, because, of course, they just want to be writing their script pages. They want to be writing their dialogue, and, they're great moments in the script. But I have them go through several relatively boring steps before they get to that part. So, and one of my students even told me Wednesday night, he said, hey, because on this past Wednesday, the students got to start workshopping actual script pages with dialogue they had written. And everybody loves that, and they all had fun. And at the end of class, one of my students said, hey, that was really fun tonight. He goes, things were really dragging for the last 2 weeks in your class, but tonight was really fun. And I thought, then I think I'm doing the right thing if the last 2 weeks were dragging, because you were doing the really hard work the last 2 weeks. So
don't forget to check out the full interview with Mark O'Connell. I had a lot of fun talking to him. Read his book, The Close Encounters Man, and go see him at this year's Wisconsin Book Festival in Madison on November 4th at the Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. You can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter @WisPodcast and on Facebook @The Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.